Hello, welcome to Serious About Law, which is a periodic podcast that features serious conversations about law, legal education, legal practice, hosted by me, Merritt McAlister, the Dean at the University of Florida Levin College of Law. We try to have these conversations while being serious about what we're talking about, not taking ourselves too seriously in the process, and focusing on things that might matter to our community of future Gator lawyers, current Gator lawyers, honorary Gator lawyers, thinking about what's happening in the legal education and the legal practice space with a special tie-in to the law school. And today I'm really honored to welcome Professor Brandice Canes-Wrone, who is a professor of political science and the Morris R. Greenberg Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, to be here with us today. Gave a wonderful presentation to our community about issues related to public perceptions of higher education, and we're going to spend some time on that. But as we try to do with all of our conversations, get a little bit of background, a sense of what led Dr. Canes-Wrone to where she is today, and some insight into her personal journey before we sort of dive into more information that might be especially interesting to our listeners who care about higher education reform in particular. So, Dr. Canes-Wrone, I'm really honored to have you here.
Thanks. It's an honor to be here, Merritt. Thanks so much for having me. And a pleasure.
Of course. I should note that you came to our radar because one very distinguished faculty member, Ben Johnson, we have you to thank for Professor Johnson because you served as his dissertation director, right?
Yeah. Another great honor and pleasure. Yes.
Wonderful. So thank you for all of that and indirectly influencing UF. Tell me a little bit, if I can, about sort of where little Brandice was and grew up and how you became interested. I mean, you've had a remarkable career of super impactful work. Was that always sort of on the agenda for you?
Thanks so much. I appreciate that nice introduction. So I grew up in the Washington D.C. metropolitan area in Northern Virginia.
Politics was sort of in the blood stream.
Yes. Those who have lived in D.C. know that it's a bit of a company town, and even more so back then. I know it's diversified a bit now with some of the tech industry. But, I always loved learning and talking about politics. But actually, I planned for a while to become a professional musician and pianist.
I noticed this. I was going to ask about it because you attended Princeton, where you also worked for a very long time, and you had a music certification. What is the music?
Classical music. Okay. So I grew up, people who know me from high school, that would have been kind of in expectation what I was doing most days after school, with practicing and performing. And I wasn't sure I was going to go to college. I thought about going to conservatory, but I did always love learning. I did always take school seriously. I had enjoyed it. It was news to me when some high school friends visited some years ago, but who I'm still friends with. And since I just thought it was really fun in high school to do things in the DC area, like go to an historical site and write about it, I thought we would all not write about it, but, I'll go to an historical place. This was back at Princeton in New Jersey. And I realized, no one else really thought this was, only I actually thought this was fun. And they seemed to think we'd be doing something much more normal. And of course, that's good. It's good to have friends that push you in different ways.
Sure.
So, I went to a great high school. I enjoyed it.
Where did you go to
I went to Langley High School, a great public high school in Northern Virginia.
Absolutely.
And then I realized as the time came, it was clear, I would feel I was really missing out by going to college. But even in college, I continued thinking I might become a professional musician. Princeton's a little unusual among universities, not unique. There are a few others that do this, but Princeton requires a senior thesis and independent research. So I did that as part of my course of study. And it just became clear to me, there's this phrase, if you can become a musician or a dentist, become the dentist.
Okay.
That I
music
really
on the
loved.
Side.
That I really loved the research. So I know that for many people in their family, doing a PhD and saying you're going to become a scholar seems kind of crazy, but it was a big relief to my family.
But relative
she's
to
not becoming a professional
the
musician.
Life of a poor musician, right? This was
It seemed like actually a safer, or at least it was an employable degree in some way. So I then I chose to do the PhD and the rest,
Yes, and then a very distinguished career at Northwestern, MIT, Princeton and Stanford.
Yes,
so really
right.
slouchy kind of institutions, right? So I'm curious, since we are going to sort of shift to talk a little bit about higher ed, what was your experience as an undergraduate at Princeton?
Oh, that's great. I had a great and I would say relatively diverse intellectual experience in that I was taking a lot of music in the humanities as well as a lot of political science and economics. I did take some of the physical and biological sciences, but not a lot. You know, if you thought, could you be more diverse, more, probably more engineering and stuff. But we all only have so much time for so many classes. So I feel fortunate. I got to know not all, but many of my professors. I'm still in touch with a number of them. Obviously, that's partly because I've stayed in academia.
Right. And you were at Princeton for quite a while, too.
Yes, and I was at Princeton. So I got to stay in touch with the music faculty as well. But I feel very fortunate to have had professors who really cared about undergraduate education and, of course, later in graduate school and graduate education. And I certainly try to bring that to my classes today.
And then your experience at Stanford, as you think about what your goals were, you were getting a PhD. What did you sort of imagine for your scholarly career and your goals there? And how was your experience at Stanford?
So again, I'm incredibly grateful to the graduate faculty. I went to a program that at the time was quite new. I entered about 5 years after the PhD program had started. I sometimes tell people who think about how to compare Stanford to some other universities that, remember, we're in Silicon Valley. Stanford's much more likely to start a new PhD program, possibly decide it's not working, but it's not going to wait for 100 other universities to start the PhD program. They're going to kind of get it. Yes. And this PhD program has been a success. It's still going. Yes, which is great. A political economy program at the business school. It's smaller. You did receive a lot of individual attention. In all honesty, I was prepared. I wanted a research career. I entered with that in mind. I was fortunate with my senior thesis advisor, Harvey Rosen, to publish my senior thesis with him, helping guide the research through the publication process. And I knew I liked the research itself, but I was actually aware that the job market is really competitive in academia. So I was just thinking I'd like a research career, ideally inside academia, but I'm prepared for the fact that these may be skills that I'll have to take outside of academia. And what that would mean, of course, was a little vaguer, but there are jobs that value high-level research. So it was a very exciting trajectory to then get a job,
You started at MIT.
I started at MIT to do well in the job market and to have a dissertation that hit. But I admit, I was, just doing what you could to publish and start there. I'll add, since it's a little relevant to reform in higher education, it was as much simply based on research interest as anything else at the time. But as a graduate student, I was a research assistant at the Hoover Institution, where I now also have a position, as you mentioned, at Merritt. And I think that was a great experience as well, because I basically experienced the business school. I was very involved with faculty in political science. And then I interacted with somewhat overlapping, but also distinct group of scholars at the Hoover Institution who obviously don't always have the canonical view of everything in academia. I mean, I was interested in the politics of the budget, and John Cogan, who's still at Hoover, actually, but he had recently come back from being director of the Office of Management and Budget, and he was doing a lot of research on budgetary issues. So this was a great project to become a part of. But I think it also helped expand my mind as to, there are lots of different perspectives. You want to be talking to lots of different people and hearing those different perspectives.
Yeah. I'm curious, and if this is too personal, you can say it's too personal, but do you think you experienced on the job market in the process any kind of discrimination because of the affiliation with Hoover?
So I don't want to sound, because I know when things go well for someone, it's easy
I don't
to over-attribute and misestimate. But I did not feel that way.
Okay. I'm glad to hear that.
Yes. No, and
we're focusing on merit, as we should, right?
Yes. It doesn't mean that other people's stories aren't their stories and their experiences. And this is true whether it's discrimination against conservatives. It's also true when it's discrimination against women, underrepresented minorities. Other people's stories are their own stories.
Right.
I did not feel that way. I do think political science has more guardrails than some fields on some of these ideological issues. I think that there is a value placed on people who can talk to different policymakers in D.C.
Because the parties change frequently,
yes,
right?
The
so
parties,
you need to have
you want people with access on both sides of the aisle. I think that there is some value placed even in the public opinion field of sort of thinking about how questions are going to hit different segments of the public. That doesn't mean political science is balanced 50-50. It's not. It doesn't mean that there aren't people who have experienced ideological bias. I think there are, and they have. But I will say the honest answer for me on the market was that I did not feel that was an issue on the market. And that is from mostly from faculty hiring me on the left. So I think that also needs to be acknowledged.
Sure. I'm glad to hear that. I think in some ways law should mirror some of what you're describing from political science. I'm not sure that we have always achieved that. I think that we're going to always have legal decision makers who have different perspectives, and we need to be able to teach and reach different audiences. I'm not sure that legal education has shown the same level of openness and celebrating intellectual diversity historically as you've experienced. So
yes. No. And that's where I also want to say the dissertation itself was a very straight up canonical dissertation. The dissertation you don't need to buy. I don't get a lot of money from the book, so you don't need to buy it. But the book that emerges from it, Who Leads Whom, President's Policy and the Public, it's a very much within the mainstream of political science. It was about when presidents use public communications to try to shape policy as well as how they respond to public opinion in their policy choices. So I didn't have a conclusion that was sort of pro either party, right?
Sort of a little more about the role of public opinion.
Yeah, it's about enduring questions of representation and accountability.
Sure. How do you describe your work as an academic? Are you a public opinion scholar? Is that what you would say?
No, I do study public opinion, but political institutions is where I come out of. But my interests have been primarily on representation and accountability. And then I've done it within the context of different institutions. But as you study representation and accountability, you become very interested in public opinion. Public opinion is a part of the representation and accountability connection. And so in that sense, I also, do consider myself a public opinion scholar. I'm less focused on, say, the psychology of public opinion. My focus is really on how it interacts with our main political institutions.
You're currently running a new program. Is it called an initiative, a program? What do we call it?
There's a center, the Center for Revitalizing American Institutions.
Okay. Yes. And you're the founding director of that program. I assume that like higher education fits within an American institution, right?
Yes, it does.
And one of the key, I think, something that many of us are proud of among American institutions is our higher education system. And I was struck with we had a lot of your early data as well as capturing some of the data on public opinion of higher ed. And there's some agreement that the centrality of higher ed in the role that it plays on innovation, on science, on training, on even inculcating civics and democracy. And that seems to be widely shared. Is that your sense?
Yes, that across partisan leanings and even really across those who have lost confidence in higher education, the sense that it is an important incubator of research and scientific development is widely shared.
Which seems like a good starting place, right? If higher ed is a space where broadly there's a lot of agreement across ideological viewpoint that it's very important in different ways, but that there's a key role to be played. It's also clear, and your research confirms and some other recent research on public opinion, that higher ed is suffering, at least from the public perception. And I think there are probably those of us who are within it who would say that it has suffered in a variety of ways. Talk some about what you think the public opinion polls show in terms of whether it's your own work or others on sort of where higher ed sits vis-a-vis other institutions of our democracy.
Okay, so there are a number of organizations that do polling have kind of looked at this. How does higher ed compare? And you often will hear that, in fact, many institutions have experienced declines in trust and confidence. Certainly our federal government has, and the federal government decline really goes back many decades to the 70s, though, there are some blips post 9/11, but the broad pattern is decline. Other institutions such as the media, they've also experienced declines. What's a little different about higher education, it has experienced a decline, but the decline really begins around 2015. And we don't have a lot of polling pre-2015, but the polling we do have suggests opinion was fairly steady in the 1990s, for instance. And that there was not overwhelming, but fairly strong confidence in higher education. So first of all, we weren't experiencing the same decline as other institutions. The second thing is that there are institutions such as state and local government that have not experienced the decline. So when we talk about how, well, there's so many institutions that we've lost trust in, that's actually not true of all U.S. institutions. And so from the inside higher ed perspective, I think we both need to remember that, hey, we weren't experiencing the same decline as the federal government, and not all institutions are experiencing decline. And so some of this, I'm not saying 100%, but some of this is within our control. And we can do things, and we can think about what's causing it and what we can do to rectify it.
I know that the at least the data that's available in public opinion, it's not as if there are surveys every year, so it's harder to capture exactly when the decline. But assuming it's around 2015, what do you attribute that to?
So I do think there are a variety of factors. When we look at the data that I've been a part of collecting, as well as looking at some of the other polls, show that the big dividing point between those who have confidence in higher education and those who do not is a sense that higher education has become politicized. So on other issues, both in terms of positive attributes, Merritt, you asked about research innovation, that Republicans, Democrats, independents, those who have confidence, who don't have confidence, overwhelming numbers are enthused about our medical centers. They're enthused about us educating citizens. Also, very strong, overwhelming numbers have similar concerns on a number of issues, such as affordability. But when you look at what separates people from those who have confidence than not, there are different ways of asking it, but the sense that higher education is now politicized, and some polls might ask about indoctrination, others might just say they try to encourage students to hold a particular point of view. That's a big dividing line.
Yeah. It's interesting. It looks like in some of the data you shared, there's actually fairly consistent public opinion across political viewpoints. One, that higher ed is too expensive and there's too much debt. Whether that's actually true in terms of the particulars, it's at least perceived that way. That it's also, I would say, not sufficiently practical or sort of with a mind towards helping students get jobs and succeed in the workplace. And then maybe too much sports.
Well,
which we won't say here at the University of Florida. Go Gators.
That wasn't the purpose of our study, but we felt we needed some non-political items.
Okay,
that
so
we didn't want people to
although
feel
70% said it was still too much sports. We don't believe that here at Go Gators. So we'll pull that one out. But across the board, for those who have a variety of confidence and lack of confidence, that there's also, I would say, in how we think about it in Florida, right, too much indoctrination. That faculty and staff, which is an interesting inclusion, right, but faculty and staff are not teaching students how to think, but what to think, right, for lack of a better term. Talk some about those results, what you see, how that's even matched some of what your maybe anecdotal observations are on the ground in higher ed.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about what the different causes were. And I think the causes are varied. But as society began taking positions on social media more frequently, there was a sense that people should be advertising their political views more. And that existed among students. I think it existed among faculty. And of course, it also existed at the highest levels, where presidents and deans were being encouraged to take positions on the major issues of the day, sometimes by people outside the university, but sometimes by students and others and faculty, for that matter, within the university. And suddenly, if you're taking positions on lots of the issues of the day and you're heavily leaning in a Democratic direction, that's going to start to give a politicized impression of the university. I don't think that's the only cause, but I do think it was something that shifted in society, in that it's not that there were never major issues on which universities were pushed. They certainly were, going back in time. But the idea that relentlessly, this is what we do, we advertise on a very routine basis all the issues that come up and that aren't necessarily central to university core business, Again, these debates existed, but they weren't as central. It's also the case that technology shifted in another way, which is that what universities were doing was suddenly very in front of people in their social media feeds in a way that when we had legacy media gatekeepers, I mean, you could say they were more aligned with universities, which I think was true, but also there wasn't space to be covering. Right now, we've got all these 24-hour news channels. We have everybody's ability to have something go viral on the internet. So suddenly, lots of things that weren't being covered can be covered. And I do think, and now I'm going to be a little bit in the opinion side of this, but I do think universities were a little bit slow to respond to this situation, in the sense that what can happen is that what people were learning about in some cases were very viral incidents that were not representative of the university as a whole. That doesn't mean they weren't real, that they didn't happen, and that there weren't actual problems with the specific incident. But if that's all you're learning, and you're not learning about the everyday activities, that's going to create an impression that is not a balanced impression of what's happening, but is a real impression of something that has happened.
Yeah. We've seen the sort of Calvin principles, Chicago principles, which is a shorthand for institutional neutrality principles, adopted more since the events in Israel and Gaza. I think so many universities wrestled with how to respond and how tricky it is, to write a statement that then it becomes like, okay, this is so hard to do, and we're getting constant calls to criticize from different angles. There seems a lot more receptivity now to that. Talk some about what role you think. I know that you're a proponent of institutional neutrality. I'm taking that from your prior talk. Some of why you think that's so important, and how you would advise universities to carry that out.
So I think your second part of the question on implementation is an excellent one, because one of the criticisms is, well, it all sounds good in paper, but implementing it is impossible. And I think implementing it is tough. That doesn't mean it's impossible or that there aren't close calls. But there are issues, the Calvin principles and institutional neutrality and variants of it involve sticking to core university business. So that doesn't mean that you are not allowed to comment on matters. There's sort of obvious ones like taxes on university endowments. Right?
Academic freedom.
Academic freedom, very strongly about core business. Obviously, universities have other issues that it could involve core business that you could claim. And I actually think one guiding principle would be to think about whether you would apply it. And again, I understand there's still close calls if it were, say, affected this group versus that group. And so one of the issues I saw some parents talking about, again, the purpose is not to call out individual universities, but in a particular university, there were some parents who were concerned as to why, when some of the visa restrictions were coming down from the Biden administration temporarily on COVID, universities weren't taking positions on that. And I think, again, that's about not one group versus another, although you could say that could be like, well, wait, do we not care about Africa? I don't think it was true that university presidents didn't care about Africa, but I think that some of the parents who were themselves African citizens and their children were coming were saying, would the universities be taking a position if it were Trump instead of Biden? And I think you could say maybe that's true, and that if you're a university president and you would not take a position if it were a Democratic president enacting the exact same policy,
then you shouldn't be speaking.
You shouldn't be speaking out about it when it's a Republican president, and vice versa. If you would take a position with a Republican, you're going to need to take it when it's a Democratic president instituting the same policy, because otherwise your voters are going to start to see you as politicized, and there's still going to be difficult calls. And even on every issue that you could call core university business, you may not want to take a public position, because you want to do other things as a university president that take a daily position on 10 things. So I sort of am sympathetic to the people who say we're not going to comment on everything just because sometimes it's easier to handle issues behind closed doors and call the administration and get them to change the policy than to be publicly criticizing them. But if you behave as a political actor, you're going to start to be perceived as one.
And lose trust and confidence because
exactly.
you are seen as political and not doing sort of the traditional academic values, which is to create space for finding truth and pursuing truth and seeing a range of ideas and viewpoints, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. My sense is sometimes I experience this as a little bit generational, where I think this generation looks to, and I don't want to malign generations, but there's a sense where, it looks to institutions, whether it's an academic institution, a corporate institution, whatever it is, to mirror values, right? And I want to be a part of something that shares my values.
Yes.
And it's very difficult, right? Because that's not a value I've wrestled with. And I sort of thought a lot about institutional neutrality early on, before we had, I think, as clear and strong of a stance, because it's very difficult to figure out what an institution's values are, right? Like, should I be polling everyone at the law school to figure out what they think on a particular issue? Right. How do I determine, we have some shared sense of those values, but they're really around, if they are on academic freedom and intellectual diversity, and those things then run counter to the idea that we should be speaking out, right? And so there's a tension between what values we elevate in the academic space and then maybe what some of our students want to see as reflecting their own personal values. That's a long-winded question, but I don't know if you got it.
No, I completely agree, and I'm really glad, Merritt, you asked it, because as a political scientist, I often focus on the political implications of our actions, and those are self-interested motivations for universities, but it's not simply a self-interested political survival question. The actually more important reason is the one you bring up, which is that we should be valuing respect for different points of view, and that when we take the position that is not one that's core to the university. And I think the Gaza-Israel, the October 7th, sort of how should Israel be responding question is a perfect one. Obviously massive debate within Israel over how the country should be responding. Why would we think there'd be no debate in the United States about, exactly what the right level of response is? And when you take that, since you're dean of a law school, you chill others' speech, right? And you say that, in fact, this is the position of the University of Florida Levin Law School, as opposed to our students and our faculty, and as individuals, our staff, they have their own positions, and our faculty, they can write about it. And if I were a student, you started earlier by asking what it was like as a student. I never felt that there was a position on a major policy issue of the day as an undergraduate that I couldn't take my own position on, on either, on any side of the spectrum, that sort of Princeton had declared that position for me. And I think we want all of our students to feel that way.
Absolutely. And I think there's been a shift. I graduated in 2002, which is a little bit after you, but I didn't experience that either. I think that there was a lot of room for students to be debating and disagreeing and arguing with the administration on things, but no one told us what viewpoint either they had or we should have. And I think that's been a shift back to your sort of dating this around 2015, where I think academia has had a different relationship with that particular question over the last decade. And maybe growing out of it and beyond.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, we seem to be shifting, but I never count on that.
There were a couple other things I wanted to touch on. One, I did notice that there's a little bit of an uptick in the data towards the end that shows maybe public confidence is sort of going a little bit back towards higher ed, across the board, across all, whether Democrats, Independents, Republicans. What do you attribute that to? One reading could be that it's agreement with maybe some of the reforms that are coming down the road across all political spectrums, which I think is surprising at some level.
So I think I'm going to put it in two buckets. I think that there have been some actions by universities, both on the political neutrality. I think universities are also trying to do more on instituting programs around civics and on civil discourse. Again, that's going to be some universities, some parts of the country, right? But it is something that's existing in different ways at both flagship public, other public, a number of private institutions. These have been catching on at very different types of institutions. So I think that that's helpful, kind of universities' behavior themselves. I think there are data out there that suggests that some of the attacks on higher ed from D.C. are not popular. And so I think there's a little bit of a rallying around the flag. What has happened, though, is you might think, well, that in and of itself will save us because, everyone's going to rally around us. But it's still the case that confidence looks more similar to the low point than to the high. We're still not above that 50. Not that being 51% would make me relax. But we're still well below 50%. And it is the case that when you look at policies such as rescinding existing grants, something like that, those are not popular policies.
Sure. So there's different ways that we can think about higher ed reform. I think, some states like Florida have been assertive and sort of leading the charge in reform from the state government, right? And which makes a ton of sense if you're a state institution like we are, right? The state law can change. The state purse strings can change in different ways that require reform. And we've experienced that here at Florida and created a lot of great opportunities. We think of the Hamilton School, which is one of those reforms that has been enormously successful. So you put together, some reforms that are sort of led by government, and that certainly the Trump administration is doing that in a variety of ways as well. And then we think about sort of internal reforms, like what a university or a law school that cares about addressing some of the legitimate concerns that I think the public has or others have with the state of higher education and some of the widespread worries about, how we educate. What would you recommend that a higher ed leader, whether a university president, a college dean, can think about addressing some of these concerns?
So, a few things. And of course, universities are going to differ a lot. So that's where I'll also say, I'll give advice generally. I think, while there are some things all universities can do, that one of the great things in the United States is that people have choice and competition, and that it's good for us to have the choice and competition from each other. Yeah. So I'm always rooting for other universities in some ways to succeed. I want that to be the case for the next generation, to have all these incredible and diverse choices. So we talked a little about the depoliticization issue from the administrator side. I mean, I think that the faculty have to own this issue as well, and that we have to think about ways. And I know a lot of my colleagues do this, so I certainly don't want to say no one I work with is doing it. They are. But I think that widely we have to think about ways in which our classroom is comfortable for students who come from very different backgrounds. And so I say this broadly, actually, because it's ideology, it's many other things as well, who have unique life experiences. And that students should feel comfortable sharing different viewpoints, treating each other with enormous respect. And part of that respect is accepting what others say in the best possible light. And so I put that language in my syllabi, that we want a lot of respect for each other, very broadly construed. We want people to be willing to say things they might not want quoted back 10 years from now because they've evolved, right? Sure. We want people to feel comfortable, and we want, as faculty, to think about those issues within our own classroom. But we also want to think about them in terms of, say, the curricula our department is offering. Are there areas that aren't getting covered? Because, again, it doesn't have to be purely ideological. It can just be we've kind of shifted in ways, but sometimes those ways overlap with ideology. And again, I think if we say, well, it's all, I think deans and presidents, provosts, incredibly important. So I don't want to minimize. Probably the most important are the senior leaders of the university. But I think if
there's an on the ground component.
If faculty count on the senior leadership to solve all of these problems, that's not sufficient. It's necessary for them to be involved. But we want faculty to be thinking about this both, again, individually in their own classrooms, but broadly. I would say that on some of the other issues, we also want to be thinking about on the career preparation and affordability. Again, I don't want us pandering to public opinion. I'm teaching political science, so I'm a big fan of classical, enduring questions in the social sciences and in the humanities. But alongside that, we can be thinking about ways in which we're preparing students for the enduring types of challenges they'll face in the workforce. And that can include I did a serious reprep of my class with how will AI be affecting the ways in which students do, if I give a take-home assignment, which I do, how is AI going to be used? It's certainly reasonable to say, I expect you to verify your sources, right? You're not allowed to just ask AI and assume AI
and have it hallucinate an answer.
Right, exactly. You wouldn't want to be on the workforce and have AI hallucinate something for your employer and then have your company go bankrupt. Right.
We worry about that a lot in the law.
We want to be responsible. But pretending AI doesn't exist is also not preparing preparing people sufficiently in all respects. So I think that we can think about those issues. I think universities can think about, I know you at Florida are great on cost, but we can think about that.
No, that's true.
Ways in which we advertise our cost versus the sticker versus advertised cost can be very different at private institutions, and we can probably do a little better there.
Yeah, this is obviously the bias of a dean who runs a law school in a very affordable state that's trying to tackle a lot of the issues that you raised, right? I do feel like there's a space for law schools to sort of be really thoughtful about these things, both from a practicality standpoint in the idea that we want to educate students that are getting skills that are essential to workplace success. Indeed, some of the reforms in how law schools are evaluated has now heavily emphasized the ability to pass the bar exam and get a job. And those seem like good developments, right?
I was just going to say, that
to address the public
seems reasonable to me.
Right, and the public perception. And then also to take seriously these critiques with respect to politicization and a lack of intellectual diversity. Law schools have to be spaces where you're engaging with people who you disagree with, because that's the whole process of the adversarial procedures. You're going to have those debates and disagreements and litigate and represent different viewpoints throughout your career. So I feel that we have a special role and responsibility to kind of tackle some of these issues. Yeah.
I agree 100%.
Yeah. Any thoughts as you were thinking about going forward, other things that universities or law schools can be doing to kind of meet this moment?
Here, I'll just mention these are universities. I certainly think law schools can do this, but it's more of a suggestion for the undergraduate level. I think that some focus on the ways in which the undergraduate curriculum relates to citizenship and the responsibilities of citizenship, because I think that we've been doing that at Stanford, so it's a little bit of a plug here for my
well, and I'll plug Hamilton School here.
And I know that the ways in which that would be done are different depending on university curricular requirements, but I think it's very important, and in fact, our STEM faculty are very supportive of these types of changes because you want those sort of questions grappled with as you're developing these cutting edge technologies. But I think that some of that then points to being a good citizen is partly listening to people from these different backgrounds. So I think that those are very compatible lessons in a democratic society.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that's a great note to end on, especially for a law school. We believe in and civics and democracy and play an important role in that. But I really appreciate your time, Brandice, and thank you for visiting us here at the law school and sharing your really important work. And we look forward to continuing to learn from you as the years go forward.
Thanks, Merritt. As I said, an honor and a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right.